to get started promptly since we have to be out of here at 5:45, and we want to take maximum advantage of having these experts here to assist us in understanding the new Global Plastics Treaty. First of all, I just wanted to give you a brief introduction as to how we happened to get here. Very quickly, I have only 2 slides, the first of which will be familiar to everybody of a certain age. There you go. So, a scene from The Graduate in which plastics are presented as the seductive future to Dustin Hoffman. We now know that they are not so seductive and they come with some costs as well. But let me just set up how we happen to be here. We're talking about the treaty negotiations. Haley, if we could move forward. So in March of 2022, the United Nations Environment Assembly took a decision in the form of a resolution crafting a remit, crafting instructions on a global treaty on plastics pollution. These are the instructions to the negotiators. Several of the individuals that are sitting up here, including myself, were at the most recent round and can talk about how these are being put into negotiating positions. The last of these is quite important to complete negotiations by the end of 2024, which was thought by some at least to be rather optimistic, but it turns out actually not. A number of treaties have been completed and ready for signature within 2 years' time, including the Ottawa Convention on Landmines. So just last month, in September, the UN produced a 0 draft. Just so that you are familiar with the term, it's something of a term of art in diplomatic negotiations, which has unusual terms like non-paper, 0 draft. The reason it's 0 is that it does not have the support of any particular government. It was prepared by the Secretariat, by the professional staff of the United Nations Environment Program in Nairobi strictly as a negotiating document. So there have now been 2 rounds of negotiation. The first was in 2022 in Uruguay, the most recent one in June in Paris, and then an upcoming 3rd round in Nairobi in November. So that is the background that hopefully frames all of these presentations. So we have here today a number of distinguished experts. In fact, I think certainly a plurality, if not the majority, of those in the Boston area that are familiar with plastics. The first is, and in the order in which they will be speaking, the first is Dr. Philip Landrigan. He's a professor of biology at Boston College, the director of the Global Public Health and the Program for Global Public Health and the Common Good. He's actually my boss, as well as the director of the Global Observatory on Planetary Health. He's a pediatrician and public health physician, board certified in environmental and occupational medicine. His research uses tools of epidemiology to elucidate connections between toxic chemicals and human health, especially the health of infants and children. And he is a global superstar in the field of epidemiology. And I think maybe that's enough.
We will give you the raise.
Okay, all right. There you go. All right, the next speaker is Hauke Kite-Powell, who is from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. He grew up in northern Germany and moved to Florida with his family in the 1970s, where he learned to dive and sail. He first came to Woods Hole as a summer student in 1985 and joined the Marine Policy Center at Hauke full-time in 1992. Dr. Kite-Powell has taught graduate courses at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and currently teaches undergraduate courses at the Massachusetts Maritime Academy. Next, we have Maria Ivanova, who is the scholar of global governance working on the performance of international institutions, the implementation of international environmental agreements, and sustainability. She is the world's leading expert on the functioning of the United Nations Environment Program and director of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern University in Boston. Her book, The Untold Story of the World's Leading Environmental Institution, UNEP at 50, provides a comprehensive analysis of the origins and performance of the UN Environment Program. In June 22, she was appointed one of 66 Foundation Fellows of the International Science Council, the highest honor awarded by the Council to those who have made remarkable contribution to furthering engagement with science. So we're very fortunate to have you here today. And then the last speaker is Joshua Lincoln, who is a senior fellow at the Center for International Law and Governance at Fletcher, the Graduate School of Global Affairs, Tufts University. We're very fortunate to have representatives of a number of academic and educational institutions in the Boston area here today, and we plan to get together and talk about how we can further work on this after we adjourn later today. Dr. Lincoln served as Secretary General of the Baha'i International Community. Between 2000 and 2013, he worked on global peace and security issues at the United Nations, including postings as Directeur de Cabinet to the Director General of the UN Office at Geneva, and as Senior Officer in the Executive Office of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in New York. So many thanks to all of our speakers. You came here to hear them, not me, and so I will give the floor to Dr. Landrigan.
Hello, is this working? Yes, okay. So thank you, David. So thank you to the Schiller Institute and to the Global Observatory for having brought us here. It's great to be with my fellow speakers. So what I'm going to do is take you through the scientific background, not the oceanography part, which Hauke will do, but the human health part of the scientific background, and then that will set the stage for the policy discussion. So I've just come off chairing this entity called the Minderoo Monaco Commission on Plastics and Human Health, supported by the Minderoo Foundation of Australia and Prince Albert of Monaco's foundation. The publication came out in March of this year in a journal called Annals of Global Health. And where do I have to put this? And with about 50 authors from around the country, including 3 or 4 BC faculty besides myself, and something like a half dozen BC students, at least one of whom is here. Any others besides Carly? I don't think so. Okay. And and our charge on this commission was to look at the hazards to human health of plastics across the whole life cycle of plastic. A lot of discussion on plastics has focused in recent years on 2 things: on plastic litter, especially on beaches, and on the complex topic of microplastics, what hazards they may or may not pose to human health. But we decided that we recognized that those were only pieces of a larger whole, and we decided to look at plastics across the whole life cycle, meaning starting with extraction of the oil, the coal, the gas, from which virtually all plastic is made, through production, through use, and on into disposal into the environment. So as David said, when plastics were first introduced, and this is a picture from Life magazine, actually a few years before The Graduate came out, talking about the dawn of a new age of disposable living, where people wouldn't have to wash dishes anymore, wouldn't have to do laundry, could just throw everything up in the air and it would magically disappear. And that was the way plastics were regarded when they first came to the market. But we now know, can I do that because I've got animations? It's going to be awkward otherwise. We now know that plastics have a dark side, that they have a lot of hazards, and our job was to the one on the right?
Yeah.
No, it's not doing it. All right, I'll just say next slide, it's easier. So next, no, keep going. Could be a dead battery in the remote. Okay, so yeah, go ahead, just bring up all the bullets. So these were the goals of our Minder Monaco. I'm going to stand up, it's easier. I'm having to twist my neck. Excuse me, Hauke.
No problem.
So these were the goals of the commission, ultimately to make visible the hazards that had previously been invisible, and with the ultimate goal of protecting human health and saving lives, and getting people beyond the notion that plastic is just an environmental problem. Of course it's an environmental problem, everybody knows that, but it's not just an environmental problem, it also has a human dimension. Next, please. And to just flip through all these bullets. So this is a graph showing the extraordinary increases in plastic production that have occurred over the past 75 years. Back in the 1950s, when plastic first came onto commercial markets, about 2 million tons were being made per year. Today it's something like 450 or 460 million tons per year. So a more than 200-fold increase over that time. Virtually all of it, which I think most people don't really recognize, is that pretty much all plastic is made from fossil carbon, and we'll talk about the relationship between plastic and air pollution and global warming in a couple of minutes, but they're all quite intimately interconnected. Production is accelerating. It's on track to double by 2040 and triple by 2060. Very, very little is recycled. That's not because of you guys. Students, I watch students around the campus. Students are very conscientious about putting your stuff in the proper bin. But the problem is with the plastic itself. The stuff resists recycling. Paper and cardboard, 65-70% recycled. Glass and aluminum, north of 80%. Plastic, 8%, 7%, something like that. And two reasons. Number one, different polymers in plastic cannot be commingled. And number two, plastic contains a lot of toxic chemicals, and that makes it unsuitable for food wrapping, for clothing, for toys, for all sorts of consumer uses. So the combination of increasing production, very low rates of recycling and reuse, means that 6 trillion tons, which is basically 75% of all the plastic that's ever been made, is still circulating in the biosphere. And it doesn't break down, it's persistent. It gets smaller, it goes from macroplastics to microplastics to nanoplastics, but it doesn't go away. Next, please. Just to show you, for those of you who aren't chemists, this is a picture of plastic. Those long lines across are the polymer, the polyvinyl, the polystyrene, the polyethylene, which is the structural backbone of all plastics, a polymer repeating simple molecules. And then stuck into that matrix are all those little molecules that you can see represented there, of which there are more than 10,000, and many of them are quite highly toxic. Many more have never even been tested for toxicity. They're just put into plastics and we don't know what they are. Next, please. And they don't stick there, they leach out, they get into the environment, they get into people, and the more studies we do of human exposure, the more studies we do of the various kinds of toxicity that these chemicals cause, the more evidence of harm that we find. Next, please. So here's a simple schematic. We had a brilliant graphics artist named Will Stahl-Timmons, you'll see his name there, who designed these pictures for us. But we looked at, we looked at 3 stages of the plastic life cycle: production, use, and disposal. Next, please. And this is an overview, but don't try to memorize it. I'll drill down into the pieces. Next, please. So let's start with production. How many of you all have ever seen a fracking well or an oil well, like up close? A couple. So you know that these are not little operations. These are big, massive deals. Like I think this one is out in Wyoming or North Dakota or someplace. The way fracking works is that they drill a well that may go down several thousand feet into the ground, depending on where they are, and then they inject water into the well under high pressure with sort of a water hammer effect, with a pulsatile driving down to the water. And the purpose is to break apart the shale, which is under the ground, and release the bubbles of gas which are trapped in the shale. And then it's not just water that goes down, it's water with a whole bunch of other top secret chemical additives in there that the companies won't reveal, which go down into the water and stay down in the ground and contaminate groundwater and other things. And next slide talks about some of the hazards that confront the workers that are involved in plastic. So starting down at the bottom left, you have the oil and gas extraction workers, and up at the top middle, the coal miners, who are, those two groups are subjected to a whole series of occupational hazards that are listed here. Traumatic injury, these are dangerous jobs, lung disease from all the dust, and then various chemical hazards. Then you have transport down in the middle, and transport of gas, of oil, coal is fraught with hazards. Think about East Palestine, Ohio, those tanker cars that turned over back in February and exploded were carrying plastic intermediary chemicals. Then the production over on the left, plastic production plants known as catalytic crackers or crackers are enormous facilities. There's one just coming on stream now outside of Pittsburgh at a cost of $6 billion, which is designed to take Appalachian gas and turn it into plastics. And what it does, the cracker takes the gas or the oil or the coal, breaks it down into small polyvalent molecules, which can then be used to build up these complex structures. And those production facilities are chemical soups, and the workers are at high risk of all the diseases I've listed here. And then at the far end of the cycle, recycling workers are exposed to all the same chemicals that are in plastic, plus additional toxic moieties that are created when plastic is burned, things like dioxins. Next, please. Then the chemicals in the factories don't stay in the factories, they spill out into the so-called fence line communities that are beside the factories. And the next slide lists a few of those hazards. It's pretty much the same chemicals causing the same effects, but the populations are different. The inside the factories, you have mostly healthy, mostly adult people working, men and women. Out in the communities, you have little babies, you have pregnant persons, you have the elderly, and therefore a much wider range of effects, including things like premature birth, low birth weight, childhood leukemia, that obviously don't happen inside the factories. Next, please. Then plastic users, when people of all ages use plastic, the chemicals leach out, they get into them. Those chemicals are not firmly bound into the matrix. And the next slide shows some of the diseases that can happen when chemicals leach out of plastic and get into people. Some of the particular bad actors in plastics are benzene, which causes leukemia, brominated flame retardants cause IQ loss, phthalates and bisphenol A, which are endocrine disruptors, can disrupt sexual development as well as intellectual function. Next, please. As a pediatrician, I always feel compelled to talk about the particular hazards to infants in the womb. Any chemical that gets into a pregnant mother is going to go through to her baby and get into the child and cause damage. The placenta protects infants in the womb against physical trauma, but it doesn't protect them against chemical exposure. And as I've laid out here on the slide, we now know that even the very lowest doses of exposure to toxic chemicals to the fetus during pregnancy can cause lifelong injury, brain damage, reproductive impairment, increased risk of cancer. Next, please. Okay, Maureen Cropper, an economist at the University of Maryland, did economic analyses for us, and she looked at two categories of economic costs. On the left side, the costs of plastic production, which she examines globally, and those are the costs of disease in workers, the cost of disease in fence-line communities, and the costs of the CO2 emissions, which drive global warming, and the EPA has devised a stratagem for calculating the social costs of carbon, which are embedded in there, and that comes up to about $600 billion per year around the world. And then she also looked at the costs of the damages to human health caused by the chemicals in plastic, and she could do that only for one country because the USA was the only country for which we had sufficient data. But in the USA, it's about $675 billion per year. So adding those two up it's about 1.2 trillion per year, and that's an undercount because we're only looking at health effects from chemicals in one country, a huge undercount. Next slide, please. And then, I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but suffice it to say that that plastic is associated across its life cycle with profound injustices. Just think of a couple of simple examples. Fracking wells are not put in places like Wellesley. Pipelines don't go through Weston. They're always in poor, minority, vulnerable communities, and social and environmental injustice. And it's not just within this country, it's globally, because a lot of the plastic that gets tossed away that we think we're recycling actually gets put on boats and shipped to some of the world poorest countries where it accumulates in enormous landfills. Next, please. Here's a couple of pictures of the social injustice. The one on the left is East Palestine, Ohio. The two on the right are snapshots from Nigeria, which is one of the countries that receives a lot of plastic waste. Next, please. So I'm going to close it there with just a quick sermon saying it's time to act. I'm glad we have colleagues here who can talk about the diplomatic nuances of what's going to happen. But one thing I want to emphasize, because I've been working for a long time in occupational and environmental medicine, and time and again I have seen the lack of complete knowledge about the hazards of a chemical used as an excuse to take no action to regulate the chemical. The chemical companies say, well, we don't really know that asbestos causes cancer, or we don't really know the molecular mechanisms by which it disrupts DNA. So why don't we wait until that research comes in, and then maybe around 2040 or 2055 we can regulate the chemical. I don't think we have that luxury when it comes to the accumulation of plastic. It's time to act. So with that, I will hand it over to Hauke.
Yeah, if I could just interrupt for 2 seconds. First of all, this event is being recorded, as I think is plain. I'm a law professor. That's the required disclosure under Massachusetts law. Second of all, I suggest we take questions to all the speakers at the end. And then third, I was remiss in not introducing Haley Rowlands, who's a volunteer here from the Law School Environmental Law Society, and she is one of our stellar performers. So over to Hauke.
Thank you. I don't know is this on? Does it need to be on? Can you hear me okay? Either way? Okay. So I want to say a couple things about plastics in the ocean, because that's my area of work. And I think it follows on nicely to the introduction that Phil gave here. You've probably heard about ocean plastic waste, and how much of a problem it is being recognized now to be. And what I want to tell you is that things are probably not as bad as some of the things you've heard, and in some ways they're worse. So there have been stories in the media about studies showing how a few years from now there'll be more plastic than fish in the oceans, for example. Or that you can see floating islands of plastic waste from space in the oceans. That's not true. There is plastic in the ocean. Everywhere ocean researchers look in the ocean, including the Arctic, the Antarctic, places you would think are a long way from any plastic waste, they find microplastics in the ocean, small microscopic pieces of plastic. But the estimates of how much plastic waste is leaking into the oceans have recently been revised dramatically downward. And I think this is an illustration of how many things we still don't know about the plastic problem. Until recently, most estimates were that 5 to 13 million tons per year of plastic waste somehow escape into the oceans. Those estimates were based on models extrapolating from sources. So people seeing how much plastic seems to drift down rivers, certain rivers, how much plastic they think is lost from fishing activity and aquaculture in the oceans and so on. The problem with those estimates has always been that we can't account for that plastic when we look at what's actually in the ocean, when you actually do studies of what's floating around, what's in the sediments. And so the most recent work on that has the value down by an order of magnitude from that. Just 500,000 tons a year going into the ocean. That's still a problem, of course. But we need to be careful, I think, when we try to regulate these things, to be honest about what we know and what we don't know. The issue of big pieces of plastic floating around in the ocean are pretty well understood. They are a problem for people when they drift up on beaches. Nobody wants to have a beach with a bunch of plastic strewn all over it. And they are a problem for animals in the sea. Marine animals, birds, seabirds, marine mammals get tangled up in plastics, or they eat it thinking it's food, and it kills them by blocking their digestive system. I'm sure you've all seen those pictures. And this is something we should clearly try to avoid. The bigger issue, though, I think, is the microplastics in the ocean. As Phil said, the large bits of plastic break down over time, some of them much more quickly than we thought until recently, into smaller and smaller pieces. And whereas most plastics initially float because they're lighter than water, by the time these pieces get small, they get colonized by biological films and other things that make them heavier, and they start to sink. And so a lot of microplastic ends up at the seafloor and is incorporated into the food web down there. Mollusks, filter feeders in particular, are susceptible to accumulating microplastics in their tissues. Small marine animals get eaten by larger ones, and ultimately by us. And so we ingest a lot of microplastics, in part by eating seafood. We also get it from a lot of other places, as Phil will be quick to tell you. So we all have these microplastic burdens in our bodies at this point. And for us, being the size we are, unlike a very small zooplankton that can get in trouble physically because of the particle of plastics that it's ingested, the particle is not probably the big problem for us, but the additives, the stuff that leaches out of the plastics, as Phil clearly showed. So ocean plastics are a problem, but not what most people think. And just to give you an idea of how difficult it is to get a handle on this, one of the big sources of microplastics in the coastal ocean is tire wear particles, car tires. Every time you drive your car, a little layer of that tire peels away, tiny little pieces. If the roadway is near the coast, and if there's, most of our water treatment facilities are not designed to filter out microplastics, that stuff ends up in the ocean. And how are you going to get a handle on that? So when it comes to large bits of plastics, you've all heard of ocean cleanup efforts, probably, trying to scoop plastics out of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's possible to do that. It's super expensive, probably on the order of $20,000 a ton. It's a lot more cost effective to have decent waste management in the first place and keep those plastics out of the ocean. If we can't not use them, if they're necessary somehow. Much more cost effective to invest in that than to wait until it's floating around in the middle of the Pacific. The second point I wanted to make is about the plastics carbon connection. Phil pointed this out already. Something like 8% of the fossil fuel we use are involved in the production of plastics, either as feedstocks or to feed those giant factories that convert fossil fuel into plastics. So they account for a significant chunk of global carbon emissions already. The value of plastics the global plastics industry is 600 billion a year. That's about half of what Phil's estimate was, and a lower bound estimate of the health costs. So it's quite possible that the true social cost of plastics is much greater than the value, the economic value in the market of those plastics. But I think we have to also be realistic. Plastics are super useful. There's a reason why they're seductive. Everything you're wearing, everything you're sitting on, everything that's in your pocket, everything in your car, there's plastics everywhere. And if we're going to limit plastic production or try to change the way the plastic industry works, we have to think really hard about substitutes. And in the history of global regulation of pollutants, most of the real success stories have been for materials where substitutes were available. Economically viable substitutes existed. If they don't, it's very hard to get people to stop using something that they find so beneficial. And so when we think about those substitutes, we need to think about the overall greenhouse gas picture associated with those as well. And it's not always intuitive. Half of the 400 million tons of plastics that we generate each year are single-use plastics, probably more than half, actually. So they're used one time and then thrown away. That's the design. That's clearly a place where we ought to focus if we want to reduce plastic production and waste and so on. But then the question is, what do we replace that with? And so examples that you may have heard of, we stop using plastic for single-use water bottles and use glass instead, or something else. There's a greenhouse gas implication to that switch too. And so the whole notion, I think, of single-use anything is something we need to examine carefully if we want to get a handle on this. So let me stop there.
All right.
So if we keep us on track.
And thank you, Hauke. At least part of the answer to Hauke's question, how do we get a handle on these public policy issues, is the new UN Plastics Treaty. And to tell us about those negotiations, we have, first of all, Maria. So, Maria, you have the floor.
Thank you. First of all, it really is a pleasure to be here with the beginning of a Boston consortium on ending plastic pollution. I'm really.
The beginning of the end.
No, it's the beginning of the beginning, or it's the beginning of the end of plastics. That way we can frame it. But Boston is the city with the highest concentration of higher academic institutions, of higher education in the world. It is imperative upon us to do something about what we teach, to do something about what we preach. And I'm delighted to be here with David. We have seen each other in the various corridors of negotiations, and to be able to think about collectively, how do we do this and how do we inspire our students to do even more and even better is amazing. So Haley, can we get something, if it works? I am here because I study global environmental governance and the UN Environment Program, where these negotiations are happening. It is at UNEP that the negotiation for a new treaty took place in terms of a resolution, and 2 is currently taking place. This is the United Nations and the United Nations Environment Program. As was discussed, the issue started as being framed as marine plastic, the plastic debris, the marine plastics, and we've all seen the images. All of the resolutions within the UN Environment Assembly to regulate this issue, to address the problem, was framed around marine plastics. This is probably also plastic made. This is the sound of plastic. Descending, the sound of plastic descending. But there's this, so historically, all these resolutions and the push for a new international treaty were about marine debris, plastic in the ocean. And then comes little teeny tiny Rwanda, right in the middle of East Africa, and says, no, it's not about marine pollution only. We are landlocked. We are small but mighty. We want to end plastic pollution. This is a picture from Rwanda of this bridge over a national park. And Rwanda was one of the first comers, one of the leaders in this space, banning single-use plastic bags in 2008. Completely banning. It's not just banning on paper, it's really banning. And when you enter an airplane to Kigali, it says, make sure you don't have any plastic on you, because you go to jail. It's as simple as that. If you have plastic bags, single-use plastic bags in Rwanda, you go to jail. That is an example of doing something without having the substitute necessarily. They did not have a substitute for plastic bags that is, use this instead. No, come up with various alternatives. And so they did. So I come to you from a point of departure from global environmental governance because I have studied this, I have written about it, I've written the book about UNEP, that is the space where these things are happening. But I have also been engaged in the Rwanda delegation to that first UN Environment Assembly session in March of 2022, where I actually did sit on the delegation because it happened at UNEP. And Rwanda sought me out as like, you know UNEP, you know the UN Environment Assembly, UNEA, please help us. And since I've been engaged with the International Science Council and on their delegation, connecting science and society and policy in these negotiations, I've moderated the science policy discussions before the INC, or the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee in Paris, and now the next one that is coming in Nairobi in November, I am again back on the Rwanda delegation. Now that I made the transition, I used to be at the University of Massachusetts at UMass Boston before, and during my transition from one place to another, I had to step down from official delegations. Now that I'm back into academia fully at Northeastern, I am also back on the delegation of Rwanda. I'd like to point out to the art here. We're talking about science, we're talking about policy, and there's the stories, and there's the visuals, and there is the change in behavior that we all want to inspire. And this enormous spigot with a tap was in Nairobi in March of 2022, with the clear call for action was turn off the tap. And this is all plastic bottles. This is what was there in Kenya. As I mentioned, continued discussing these issues and moderating the science and policy discussions in these intergovernmental negotiations. And I think that is the space where we, as academic institutions, not only have an opportunity, but we have an obligation to engage. The chair of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee now, this is Ecuador, Luis Valles, who was Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ecuador. He has committed personally to bringing science and society together, working very closely with the Minderoo Foundation and with the Minderoo Monaco Commission. So in a multilateral environmental agreement, that's what an MEA is in a law school setting, there are a few key issues that we need to think about. There are the legislation and regulation at the national level. What exists at the national level determines whether and to what extent a country can actually do something internationally. The United States is the case in point. If there is national legislation and regulation, the US is more likely to join an international treaty. So the question here is, what do we have nationally, locally, federally on plastic regulation? So to BC Law School, please figure that out. Please figure out how we could have real legislation and regulation on plastics. We are in Massachusetts, which was the first state that the governor banned single-use plastic bottles from all federal agencies. So what can be done nationally will to a large extent determine the US's position internationally. And then in any treaty, in any international treaty, you have obligations that relate to management, to institutions, to information and reporting, the technical issues, and of course the financial issues. I'm sharing this with you because I have been studying with my team, first at UMass Boston and now at Northeastern, the extent to which countries implement the international obligations that they have undertaken under various treaties on pollution, in chemicals in particular, and conservation with the biodiversity treaties. So we have studied this at some length of the different international agreements. And what we have found by comparing across the different clusters is that a few things matter more than others. Mainly that collaborative processes are critical. Even though treaties are about regulation and they're about prohibiting and thou shalt not, when it's possible to collaborate, when it is possible to do things together, countries tend to enter into these agreements. They tend to do more. Then the consistent and continuous building of capacity. Often, countries are not able to deliver on their commitments, not because they don't want to, but because they cannot. Whether it's because a substitute is not available, or whether it is because their public doesn't know, or there are environmental justice issues, there are constraints that are structural or systemic that prevent member states, and often they're the businesses that operate in them from doing the right thing. And finally, reporting is something that is often neglected, and yet it is a critical feature in a successful, in an effective treaty. What are we doing? And how well are we doing it? Often, especially in legal settings, we think of it as name and shame. Name the polluters, shame the polluters. What we have found by looking and studying these international agreements is that another tactic with reporting also works, and that is name and acclaim. Name the countries or companies or campuses that are doing well. Then they stand up and they want to be counted. And that inspires others. This is what Rwanda did. It was Rwanda and Peru who led member states at the UN that brought us to this treaty, to this resolution on creating a new international treaty to end plastic pollution. Not to limit, not to control, not to think about it. No, to end plastic pollution, and as David mentioned in the beginning, by 2024. No, by 2040, and the treaty has to be decided by 2024. But the resolution itself, it says end plastic pollution by 2040. I mean, honestly, that's not a usual framing of an international agreement to be so decisive and by a certain date. And that happened because of two small states, Rwanda and Peru. And they had not been active in the international arena before. They had not been champions that you say, oh yes, look at what Rwanda is doing. But they were enabled, they did it. They had the courage and they built out the capacity. So I'm only going to flag this, and then David can share the slides in case you are going to delve into this in some of the law classes, in terms of what are some key suggestions for science policy bodies. This at the moment is a really important discussion of the science policy interface. It's happening for chemicals, and how do we connect science to the policy? It's happening now for the plastics, and we're discussing, should we bring chemicals and plastics in the same space? Do we need one body? Do we need one institutions? How do we think about these issues? And so there's some ideas that have been floated around, is that to have an independent scientific committee. I'm particularly enamored of a plastic pollution observatory. Imagine that there could be so many different ways of observing plastic pollution, and so many innovative ideas of a plastic pollution observatory, or a global plastic database and clearinghouse, or scientific advisory panels for the various impact assessments, whether it's on health, whether it's on environment, and an advisory group on plastic waste management innovation. We heard that a lot of it can be stopped before it needs to be recycled. So how do we do that, and how do we learn from each other? And then we do have a zero draft, as David mentioned, for a new treaty. And we've also, I presented this to governments as one of the first webinars before the International Negotiating Committee. And I've kind of drafted out these 10 guiding principles for the Plastic Pollution Treaty. Most importantly is the clear objectives. But what are the objectives? And that's where we do need to know more. This is what we'll be discussing. But end plastic pollution is a big objective, but how feasible is that? How do we operationalize it? What does that really mean? And then it's really important that treaties are flexible. And flexible means that they can go up, and become more and more challenging, and be braver. It's also important to have enforcement and compliance measures. How do you enforce this? And whether it could be by information, name and shame, name and acclaim, but there need to be measures in those treaties. And participation, include more people, include more countries, more campuses. And that science policy integration is really at top of the agenda right now. How do we make that happen? Then the capacity for implementation, as I already mentioned briefly, the financial support. The discussion is, do we create a fund? Like we are talking about, like we have a green climate fund, or we have funds for the various chemical conventions. How are we going to support this in various countries? And then who's going to monitor? Who's going to make sure that what is committed to really happens? Those monitoring and reporting mechanisms, and importantly, the public awareness and engagement. This is where I think we have an absolute responsibility as academic institutions to play a more active role, a leading role, not just be on the sidelines and follow the governor after she bans plastic bottles, but to see how can we step ahead? What can we do as academic institutions that is ahead of the next regulation, or that spurs the next regulation? And that is that long-term vision. We have it. We are sitting in a university that has had a long-term vision. This is the one thing about universities. They're not created from today to tomorrow. They are anchor institutions. They are around for hundreds of years. If you look at the universities that really prided themselves in what they do, they would tell you our history is, at Northeastern, on October 3rd, we just celebrated 125 years of excellence, of experiential learning. I mean, that is a lot. But there are universities in this city that are much older than the United States as a country. And so therefore, because we are not only the posterity, we are the ancestors, we have to take that long-term vision. So there are key sections of that zero draft that I would like to leave with you, David, for your classes as you talk about these issues. And I would like to offer my email because I am on the delegation of Rwanda. I will be sitting with countries negotiating around the clock what's going to happen to that zero draft. I would like to receive inputs. We'll see what countries can do about them, but it's important. That is that science policy interface. So I'm offering the opportunity to really engage in the negotiations, and I'd be happy to come back afterwards and that we do another session because we will be in Nairobi.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
And see what happened. How courageous were governments? Why? Why not? And what's going to happen at the next level of the negotiations, which will be in Canada in April. And so perhaps we could think of how universities can bring whole delegations of students because Canada is closer, and we can arrange some type of presence in that space. So thank you for having me here.
And thank you, Maria. We, as you were speaking, I could see my to-do list growing longer and longer. I see some of my students here. If anybody is interested in an independent research project on any of the issues that she discussed, particularly about analyzing the content and the structure of the zero draft, contact me. And then we have Joshua Lincoln from the Fletcher School, who was also in Paris. He's going to talk about global governance, and I'm interested to hear what he has to say about Paris because there was some global non-governance going on there and a little bit of dysfunction in real time. But in any event, over to you.
Thank you. With your permission, I'm going to go stand over there so I can see everybody. Is that all right?
Please do.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. Thanks for organizing this. Very timely, and there's been quite a nice progression through the speakers. And so I'm going to do my best not to repeat anything that was said, and to self-delete all the big points that were prepared that have already been mentioned, because I think we can have the most fun by taking the next step. I'd like to talk for a little bit. I'm going to try and focus in on the negotiations and focus in on the treaty itself and where it's at in that sense. I'd like to talk about a couple design issues, what are called treaty design issues, and then maybe a couple minutes talk about the actors and try to analyze or think about the different actors that are involved here and where we are in this process. So Dr. Landrigan's report, the Minderoo report, so it was actually quite a significant report. I remember reading through that thing going, wow. And to me, it's been interesting because by virtue of setting in motion the negotiations for a treaty, you prompt a whole bunch of scientific inquiry that didn't exist before that. That alone might be a good reason to start treaty negotiations on a whole bunch of issues, because everybody turns around, all the foundations, all the money comes out and says, oh my God, we need to study any number of the issues that have been mentioned here today. And in a very short period of time, 2-3 years, you get a massive inflow of additional scientific information that lets you arrive at a far better understanding of some. It's like going to the doctor. You're going to find out by the time you come out. You're going to have a much better appreciation for what brought you in. So we've heard a little bit about the distinction between pollution and carbon, and plastics is both. Plastics is pollution and plastics is carbon. Traditionally, they have been dealt with through different types of treaties. So pollution treaties, typically, so we could call, let's give a couple of examples. The Minamata Convention on Mercury would be the youngest one. The Montreal Protocol on the ozone would be another one. We could add to the list. But typically, they identify a set of bad pollutants. And we do our best to ban them through a fairly clear set of obligations. It's narrow, it's tough, and it's usually a matter of obligation. Because we all recognize that for this narrow set of chemicals or pollutants, we need to take essentially banning action. It takes time, schedules, scopes, lots of annexes, but usually they take the form of being sort of strong in an application over a very narrow space, if you will. Carbon, on the other hand, carbon has defeated us so far in terms of international treaties. The only treaty we have is the Paris Climate Agreement. And that one is specifically designed to get around the fact that you couldn't get anybody to agree to the kind of pollution measures that we originally wanted back in Copenhagen. The sort of approaching carbon as pollution failed in Copenhagen, essentially. And we'd come back around to it in Paris and say, okay, here we're going to move to a more voluntary approach. All countries, it's sometimes I call it the buffet approach or the potluck approach. We all say what we're going to bring to the table. We're under no more obligation than to say what we intend to do about the specific issue. The problem, if you've ever been to a potluck, is if everybody brings pasta, it's a really unfruitful potluck. And we have a little bit that same problem. And so we are dealing with a subject matter in plastics that is a cross between these two sets of issues. And so sometimes an interesting way to think about it is to think of maybe we need a pollution treaty that sits inside a carbon treaty. And you sort of, we're going to have to ban some things, otherwise this is, you heard reference to the chemicals, the 13,000 chemicals, 6,000, 3,000 which are confirmed. We are going to have to do something with those, but there is no answer as of yet as to how to deal with plastic as carbon. And this is brings us a little bit to the next issue, which is the question of ambition. You might have heard, if you follow the plastic treaty or follow other treaties, people like to talk about whether a treaty has ambition or not, which is Diplo code for is it trying to do a difficult thing. And in this case, the difficult thing is banning production of primary plastics. There is a range of agreement and disagreement over probably all the other areas. How should we recycle? What will we recycle? In what term? How are we going to organize it? All those things can be discussed. In the end, sort of one of the most significant fault lines is, are we going to tackle the production of primary polymers, meaning the huge amount of new, overwhelmingly single-use plastic that is produced every year. That gets complicated because fossil fuel extraction, resin making, and production of primary polymers is concentrated in low-income countries. Again, this is where the just transition issues begin emerging. Who benefits from what, and where are different countries and economies based in this overall global economics of plastic? Usually the next question that comes up is effectiveness. Again, a bit of a negotiator's term or a lawyer's term, but it is, again, code for a whole set of issues that you usually begin to find inside the treaty. One of Maria's slides had a number of them, which are a matter of saying, great, you could have a really ambitious treaty, but if it is an ineffective treaty, that's actually the worst kind of treaty, because we went and pledged to do all kinds of big things and did absolutely nothing in the text to ensure that we got them done, and everybody walks away having done nothing and not believing in treaties anymore. So there is a tight balance between how wide the ambition you set for your treaty and how effective you make it. And in this case, effectiveness is usually a matter of what actual obligations are in the treaty, what actual implementation mechanisms are in the treaty, the follow-up, the reporting, the monitoring. Is there a way in which performance is examined under the treaty? Do you name and shame? Do you name and acclaim? Do you have a closed-door system? Is it expert-driven? Do you pay a cost if you don't meet your benchmarks? There are a range of issues that you can think through in this process. Another aspect, an important one, is it doesn't amount to a hill of beans unless you can finance it. So financial mechanisms. Will there be a financial mechanism at the heart of the treaty to raise the money necessary to implement the treaty? And usually different states, different parts of the world have differing abilities to finance meeting their responsibilities under the treaty. So this zero draft, for example, has a placeholder. It provides for a financial mechanism. It sets a range of options for what that might look like. I was asked, along with some of my colleagues from the Fletcher School, to look at a Ghanaian proposal that said, let's create a financial mechanism that is based on direct taxation of those companies that produce primary polymers. There are very few governments in the world today who would agree to such a thing. But it's a really interesting notion, but it's never been done before. No international treaty has ever gone directly and taxed industry as a means of curbing production. Okay, well, probably won't make it through, but it's an interesting idea from that standpoint. I talked about the design issues in order to then come around to the actors right now. I think Maria made mention of the High Ambition Coalition, Norway and Rwanda leading that group. And there is a large, I would say a majority of states that want an effective treaty. That much is clear. Along with David and Maria and others, we were at the second round in Paris. And I come originally from the peace and security side of the United Nations. So I'm used to watching the Security Council and things like that. And I've been told this is the environmental domain. We do things very differently here. You know, we have a sort of a code of behavior. We for the most part leave geopolitics at the door, and we have a process that we follow in the environmental treaty space. I was amazed watching the first 4 days and the behavior in there. I thought I was in the Security Council. And largely because of the blocking behavior, the delaying behavior, the ship sinking behavior, I think would not be. And it was interesting to watch and to observe. And you have to ask yourself why. And I think this would be a question I'd be curious if others have a view about. Because of the times in which we live, are we seeing geopolitics drifting into the room more than has been the case in the past? Because I thought that's what I saw. I'm not sure. I want to see in the next round. But I was, the list of countries who were, what's the right word? Seeking to defeat the process. I'm not saying the treaty, but they were trying to block and to delay and to minimize and to constrain. A couple months later, let's just say that the BRICS got together in South Africa and invited a couple additional countries to join them. If you took the list of BRICS members and the BRICS plus members they invited to join, you got an almost exact list of some of the states providing blocking behavior in Paris. And that, but it's the same list if you went, not the same exactly, but it's very close to the list of major oil state producers. And that list is all very similar to the list of major primary polymer producers. Why? Because most petrostates, the first thing they do is sell oil for energy and then create a petrochemical industry. And that petrochemical industry is then owned by the sovereign wealth accounts of those particular countries. So there's a very close alignment between some of these things, and we're going to have to watch that in the next round. On the non-state actor side, for me at least, it was really interesting to see science at the table, or science not at the table, science present in the hall. I think there were some issues around it not being at the table. But we have a set of sort of business. That was an interesting thing. Business present in the room, along with civil society, along with science, as observers, but also clearly talking to delegations, trying to work quite actively towards specific outcomes. Business itself, though, divided, I would say, between brands and petrochemicals. Brands having a strong incentive to see a strong treaty and wanting the norms to be set so that they have clear rules for competing in business on. Petrochemicals, not interested so much in those things. So this is the first time that I'd seen a negotiation where business was actually split in some ways. And that was an interesting thing to observe. New technology, there was a reference to bioplastics, plastic alternatives. There are startups, there are companies that are just coming online with the beginning of interesting, viable, scalable, new technologies that might help us solve some aspects of this problem. In a way, I don't wish that we were having this negotiation 10 years from now. I wish that they'd been doing the development 10 years ago, because we might have at the table more solutions that we could actually help to put into the overall text itself. But that is happening in parallel. And I think the last group is civil society, as ever. In this case, also including particularly affected communities. I made reference to the fact that if you go upstream to the production of polymers and plastics, that affects particular communities, particularly in the global south. And on the other end, all the way downstream in the recycling corner, again, you have communities in the global south of what we sometimes call waste pickers, but they relabeled that in the negotiation the green force. So we don't deal with waste, we're producing recycling in that sense. And those communities are also affected by this. So the zero draft, to wrap up, I think we can ask others how they feel, but we were all holding our breath. I was holding my breath to see whether the zero draft would have all the elements in it for starters. After that difficult round two, the fact that there was an agreement to produce a zero draft as David said, is a negotiating technique. You put a piece of paper out there, and we have to stop talking about what's important to me, what's important to you. We have to both talk with respect to the paper. So all discussions from now on are respect. You have to name the page, you have to name the article, you have to say what you want in or what you want out. And it's a way of narrowing the field of negotiation and discussion down to a piece of paper. And then that will go through. It still means everything can fall out of that draft. But the good news is, until today, nothing has been taken out of the draft. And there was some concern that we were going to show up and see that the paper was half empty. So almost article by article, I mentioned, for example, the curb on production of virgin polymers, of plastic primary polymers. There's two options in the draft. It says countries shall and countries may. Option one, option two. And if you go through the draft, you will see that in a number of different places. So now the hard business of negotiating, specifically whether it's going to be shall or may, and exactly in what form, article by article or subject by subject, is going to proceed. And that's going to be interesting to watch. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Josh. And with respect to your last point, I think it's very interesting to see how, despite all the bad behavior in Paris, a zero draft was produced. There's something of a cognitive dissonance between what happens when states get together and engage in sort of externalization of their anxiety collectively, and then what goes on with the experts in the Secretariat. They're really two different things.
Yeah.
But that's just me, and I think we have time for some questions. So please, questions to our Boston-based or Massachusetts-based experts. Yeah, reactions.
I'd love to hear what people think in the audience rather than ask us.
Excellent. Well, and this is your future. I mean, this is an instrument that is supposed to be fit for purpose going forward to deal with the needs of your generation. I'm looking at students as well as the needs of your grandchildren and their grandchildren. So what sort of reactions do you have? Thank you very much. Questions? Yeah.
Yeah, this is more of a question, sorry. not
Is
an
it
action,
sitting on the microphone?
but,
Yeah, can we,
Since this is being recorded, do you mind using the microphone?
thanks, Phil.
Is it on?
I think you need a question. Yeah.
Go green.
And turn it on.
Look for green.
There we go.
There you go.
So I guess in terms of when you're drafting these agreements, these environmental international treaties, how do negotiators and countries feel about, how do they feel about the role of trade agreements that only come into play when a certain number of signees have signed? Or is it the case that certain countries seem to favor those depending on their size, economic prowess around the world? That's really my main concern.
Josh?
Is this your area?
Well, why don't we hear if you'd like to take a shot at answering the question.
I'll try based on what I understood. An agreement like this will be the same. It will have to be ratified by a number of countries before it comes into force. And I think there are a couple provisions in the zero draft that relate to trade. And part of that is a wink and a nod to the fact that there's another process going on under the World Trade Organization that is dealing with plastics. And part of the challenge is how those two processes interrelate. I don't know enough about the particularities of it. I know that they've been carrying on a kind of what they call, I believe, a dialogue on plastics and trade for a couple of years. But it's an interesting example, the way in which the WTO arrives at rules governing trade in plastics and how it will interact with this treaty.
Yeah, I'm just the moderator here, but if I could offer a few additional insights. One of the problems, first of all, Donald Trump doesn't understand how trade agreements work. And the way they work is by deregulating trade and deregulating market access, so that you have basically this deregulatory push coming from the WTO, and then you have interventions in what otherwise would be an unregulated marketplace through the plastics treaty. So they're basically in opposition to each other, and they need to be reconciled, as Josh suggests. There are some areas where trade agreements work very well with environmental interests, such as removing subsidies for fossil fuels. That's something that's going on in the WTO right now. The WTO recently did a fisheries agreement because there are a lot of subsidies for fisheries as well, and there's a lot of trade in fish. So yes, there are areas for overlap, but that basically deregulatory push needs to be overcome in order to assure the efficacy of this agreement. We've dealt with this before, for instance, in ozone, stratospheric ozone depletion, where trade in chlorofluorocarbons is expressly addressed by the Montreal Protocol, and it is limited. So that, but we do need to overcome this downward drag, this inertia from the trade regime that's going on out there without being too visible. So an important point to highlight. Other observations, questions? Yes, over here.
I just had a follow-up for Josh, talking about reporting frameworks, and you mentioned there haven't been any taxation of producer schemes enacted. I did a little bit of work before law school with reporting frameworks in Europe and new ones in Oregon, and I think there's one pending in New York and also in California for reporting plastics use waste.
Yes.
How much of these frameworks can be considered as creating a unified standard set of guidelines rather than, at least in the United States, 50 different frameworks over the next 10 years, or in the case of the world, hundreds of different frameworks across different countries, municipalities, different countries? What has that consolidation process looked like to come up with something that will be, that companies, the large producers out there like Coca-Cola, Amazon, what does it look like in creating a framework that multinational corporations can comply with across hundreds of different jurisdictions?
Again, I'll try and answer your question to the limit of my work capacities on this one. But you mentioned California. That's an example. There are pieces of behavior experience dealing with particular problems all over the world, actually, in different ways. You can look at parts of Europe. People have been trying things in different spaces, different ways. So in California, they passed a law on plastics last year, and it involves a sort of the obligation of an EPR scheme, an extended producer responsibility scheme, and so but there's nothing at the global level, and there's certainly nothing on either a financing mechanism or I would say on a financing mechanism at the global level. Reporting, there's a lot of experience. A number of my colleagues look at treaties, as do I, outside the climate area. And so let's talk human rights treaties and reporting. Let's talk nuclear, what do you call it, architecture agreements and reporting. There are some really interesting bits and pieces of experience in different areas that the problem usually is if you go and you talk to nuclear experts, out of that process, say, oh, don't bring anything environmental. We don't do environmental mechanisms in here, and often the same will be true back. We're less convinced about that generally. We think good ideas should kind of be explored and migrated across. So the reporting, I think, is interesting. I think if I had one concern actually about the zero draft, it's that whole side is a little bit, the strongest formulation of it is still too weak, if I can say it that way. I would have liked a really strong formulation, then you would expect it to get watered down by 50%, and we'll end up with something that would be reasonable. I don't know, Maria might have a particular view on the reporting side of what's there. Not good. Maybe you want to confirm that.
No, I mean, it could be better.
Right.
And the reporting side is certainly an area that needs to be developed. And I don't know of which treaty has the best reporting requirements or mechanisms, and I don't think we could point out to one. And this is
the answer. I think now is the time of to explore different options and see what can we amalgamate into a new treaty, and that's an area that deserves much greater attention. But I don't know in these negotiations whether you can go up or from zero draft you can only go down.
Shall I try to answer that? The answer is that there's no upper limit, right? More dramatic proposals, more aggressive proposals can be made. In fact, among the students that are here in the room right now, they are negotiating at this very moment a new Codex Alimentarius standard for the term natural, in a labeling standard for the term natural in raw and processed agricultural commodities. So some of them are making more dramatic proposals, more aggressive proposals than those in the draft, the analog of the zero draft, and some are working. They'll have instructions.
So
to
then
work.
let me put this to add to the to-do list. I mean, by the beginning of November, and I'm quite serious about it. If you had suggestion for this should be on the reporting side, and then some examples of here's how this has worked, and it doesn't need to be in the environment area. It could be in another treaty. It could be on landmines. It could be on nuclear. I mean, seriously, I am putting this out to law school students, faculty, researchers. What are some good examples? What would we like governments to discuss?
Yeah, one important point about reporting is that this is the principal implementation mechanism in these treaties. States get very nervous if you start to talk about enforcement or punishment or any sort of penalties. And so we tend to talk about compliance, implementation instead. And self-reporting is the most important vehicle for that. A state puts out a report, and then it can be criticized by its own citizens, by citizens from other countries. And I would just suggest that, I think I'm adding to my own to-do list here, but the International Labour Organization is really a model of collecting information and then implementation through standing mechanisms to evaluate states' compliance. Another question, comment?
Following on the ILO, I was going to say WHO, that there are certain diseases like cholera, smallpox, polio, that countries are under very strict obligations to report the occurrence of even a single case. Not always followed, but the obligations are quite strict.
Great. So, and the students who were in the classroom here, or in the room here, are students of the World Health Organization as well. All right. Other questions or comments?
One thing that folks need to understand, and we emphasize this in the Monaco report, is the reason plastic production is going up so rapidly is the convergence of two factors. Number one, the market for fossil fuels to be burned, like think gasoline, think diesel, is going down. Not as fast as we'd like, but it definitely is going down. And the companies that produce, these vertically integrated companies that produce both fossil fuels and plastics, see that trend. And at the same time, they're sitting on unprecedented increases in carbon feedstocks. Fracking has just opened up whole new fields of fossil carbon that weren't accessible 10 years ago. So they've got this stuff. They're not making a profit as long as it sits in the ground. They can't burn it anymore, so what are they going to put it into? And I think that's precisely the combination of factors that's responsible for this massive increase that Hauke mentioned in the production of single-use plastics, the one and done. So the two strongest recommendations that we made in the Monaco report is, number one, there needs to be a global cap on the production of virgin plastics. I know it's a no-go, it's like a carbon tax. But speaking as a public health person, if you don't do primary prevention, you're constantly chasing your tail. You just never get there. Cleaning up the ocean is like cleaning Notre Dame with a toothbrush. And coupled with the cap has got to be very strict regulations on the production of the single use, because certainly some plastics are essential. You need in medicine, I can think of a dozen uses, that things we just couldn't do without plastic. But there's a lot of other uses in medicine, like plastic sheets that are used once and tossed away, which could easily be replaced with alternative materials.
Just one other observation, and then we have to wrap up. Very briefly, from an industry point of view, we're dealing with the fossil fuel industry on one side, and we're dealing with the petroleum industry, which is basically a subset of it. And so there's clamping from an industry point of view going on, both from the point of view of carbon emissions and the Paris Agreement, as well as the plastics negotiations, and they are definitely related. Okay, I am getting the sign that we need to excuse ourselves to make room for the next event in this room. Thank you all very much for coming. Many, many thanks to our 4 speakers.